the problem of self-predication that Celso is going to spell out in his talk. He already told us at the beginning of the meeting that he moved as postdoc at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum. So he works within the team of Barbara Sattler. And I'm very pleased to have you here today. So, Celso, I leave it to you. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate your invitation and thank you everybody for showing up. So, first of all, can you hear me? It's okay? Because, okay. So I'm going to read from a text, and I guess it will be better if I share my screen while I read so that you can read with me. And hopefully it will work.
You have to use your share button. Just okay, excellent, perfect.
You're seeing, right? Okay, so let's begin. I'm sure it will be more clear if I read it. So Timeaus 38c reads, the model of eternity is existent for all eternity, while the other, the imitation, was, is, and will be powerfully for all the time. In saying that the model, that is eternity, is eternal, and the imitation or time is sempiternal, these statements fall into what is broadly called self-predication in the literature, that is, a predication in which subject and predicate are deeply related, maybe more than they should. Similar occurrences appears all over Plato's dialogues in all the three periods. We have examples like the justice is just, the beauty is beautiful, the largeness is large. Read in the usual ways we understand this syntactical construction, these statements are either trivial, if they make a claim of identity, or false, if they make an ordinary predication. Hence, the attempt in the literature to make sense of them in an alternative quasi-technical way. In spite of the ample treatment of the subject,
Celso, sorry if I interrupt you, but
okay.
Could you please enlarge the screen so that because we cannot read
of course.
it really. Thank you.
It's better right now. So.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So, in spite of the ample treatment of the subject, the occurrence in the Timeaus is mostly mentioned en passant. Yet, I believe it presents a promising case study due to its unique context. The use in the dialogue is like no other because there we find an applied version of the self-predication with the focus on the cosmogonical role of a particular form and its imitations. The other occurrences are more general and preoccupied with epistemology. In the following, I intend to examine how ordinary predications and self-predications work, which are their similarities, differences, and relations if we take into account their use concerning eternity in the Timeaus. Hopefully, the analysis will throw some light in Plato's use of predications. So at first, start with ordinary predications, and then we will see what is special about self-predication. Exemplification. How to understand a predication may vary according to the status we confer to each of its three terms and their relation. The components are the single term or subject, the verb to be, and the predicated property. In the most common reading, a predication makes a realist descriptive claim about a particular entity having a sparse property. Hence, the jellyfish is eternal means that this particular entity has the property of being eternal. In a realist framework, once the property is sparse, the single term jellyfish is the natural truth maker. The statement is true if and only if the referred jellyfish has the attributed property, or, to use the technical term, if the jellyfish exemplifies being eternal. The truth of the claim is then responsive to the state of affairs it describes. Our interest, however, is in Plato's use of predication, which will require a lot of adaptation to this general understanding. Before we examine the text, exemplification is nothing but a placeholder for how sensible things have their properties according to Plato. This unloaded version of ordinary predication already suffices to expose one of the problems of self-predication. In a self-predication, the single-term position is occupied by a form, while its defining property occupies the predicative place. If we compare justice is just and Socrates is just, it becomes clear that it makes no sense to think that the form of justice is just in the same way that just people are so. Hence, the two predications should have different meanings, truth makers, and so on. After comparing the sentences above with the equivalent cases concerning eternity in the Timeaus, a variation becomes clear. In, say, eternity is eternal, and Zeus is everlasting, the difference between the predicate of a form and that of a particular entity is well marked by the use of different adjectives. The variation indicates that each entity might exemplify different types of total duration. In the Timaeus, Plato uses aion when eternity is a subject and varies between three adjectival forms when saying that things have the same sort of total duration, have some sort of total duration. Aionios, diaionios, and aidios. As the extensive treatment in the literature testifies, there is no one evident pattern for the application of these adjectives. Nonetheless, with the aid of some contextual information, one might distinguish different types of total duration in the dialogue. A non-exhaustive list would have eternity and absolute permanence outside time, abeternity, this term is by Robinson, still outside time but with some movement, sempiternity, total duration attached to time, that is infinite duration with a beginning at the beginning of time, and end in the unlikely event of the end of the time. Everlastingness, infinite duration, and not when a beginning does not coincide with the beginning of time, and alternity, eternity by a discrete recurrency of different instantiations over time. This classification is more nuanced than the numbers of adjectives used by Plato, but all of them seem to be necessary to account for the different total durations we find in the dialogue. The difference between abeternity and everlastingness, for instance, is necessary to account for the difference between the demiurge and the other gods, respectively. The demiurge exists outside time, even if, at least in his thought, movement plays some role. The gods are immortal, but since they were created by the demiurge, they have an origin that does not coincide with the beginning of time. Moreover, their immortality is contingent because it depends on the will of the demiurge. The absolute eternity of form seems to be above that of the demiurge since they have no relation to movement at all. Finally, at the bottom, we have the things which are subject to generation and corruption. For them, total duration may be at maximum a matter of repetition. So, in the other discussions of self-predications, the vocabulary of participation predominates. The Timeaus, on the other hand, privilege the vocabulary of imitation. The hierarchy of types of total duration is based on at least a binary relation between the model of eternity and its imitations. In this context, the exemplification of a property conveyed by a predication should be understood in light of the relation of imitation of a model. Thus, time sempiternal is elliptical for the triadic relation time sempiternal by imitating eternity. For an x to exemplify f is for x to be an imitation of the form fness, exemplifying it with some degree of imperfection. Given the importance of the framework of imitation, it is worth exposing some of the necessary and contingent features of the relation of imitation. An imitation must be at least a binary relation between an imitation and an imitated, at least asymmetrical and potentially hierarchical, since the imitation depends on the imitated but not vice versa. Combination of resemblance and imperfection. The imitation must satisfy a minimal threshold in the resembling the imitated, but it cannot do so perfectly. Otherwise, we would have a clone or repetition. Furthermore, imitations need not but may be interspecific. The imitation and the imitated may have different modes of existence, depending on the mediation of an imitator, and remote, where there is a contactless causal relation between imitated and imitation. With these features in mind, we can see that predication in the Timeaus is a tetradic relation involving a particular having a property by imitation of a model produced by a craftsman. The relation between forms and exemplifications is not only asymmetric, but also hierarchic. The Timeaus having a type of duration is explained through different degrees of the relation of imitation with a perfect model. The model is eternal, then we have the imitation of eternity, which is sempiternal, the everlasting beings, and so on. The hierarchy cannot be put in a simple scale, but rather in a one over many model, such as, hopefully you can see the model here. The top of the hierarchy is a model, and as such, it is separated from the rest. All the others are imitations of the model, so one over many. Thus, they are what they are in virtue of being an imitation of eternity. In the scheme, eternity is functioning as the truth maker for any other sort of total duration. Deus is everlasting is true only if the single term Deus satisfies to some degree being an imitation of eternity. However, since we have different degrees of imitation, in the second section, the scale remains with the warning that eternity might not fit in. I'm not going to discuss this problem here. The fact that there are degrees of imperfection grounding the secondary hierarchy reveals another feature of Platonic predication. The scale of types of duration seen above is clearly hierarchical. For instance, time sempiternity is the best possible copy but falls short of it, while humans' alternity is despised by the demiurge. Thus, we can see that having a property for Plato is a thick matter. Together with the description of having a property, there is also a prescriptive side which carries some judgment of value. Nowadays, the most intuitive examples of thick predications involve morally loaded predicates. When one says Socrates is just, there is a description but also a prescriptive value. The predication says that Socrates has a given property and also that he is good in having, in virtue of having it. The case of eternity in the Timeaus, however, presents us with a wider sort of prescription that is not necessarily morally loaded. Once we have added a prescriptive side to the predications in Plato, we will need not only a truth maker for the description, but also some sort of a value maker or value measure to assess a predicate. Looking for a value measure unveils another peculiarity of how Plato conceives exemplification. We have seen that the model grounds the descriptive side of exemplifying a property by causally explaining why something has an F. It could well be that it also serves as a measure to assess in what degree it succeeds in doing so. That is to say, that the model of eternity would serve both as the truth maker and as the value measure of a thick predication in Plato. Something would exemplify a total duration if and only if it is an imitation of eternity, and how good it is this exemplification should also be assessed in view of the model. However, if we think about the role of the model in relation to the description and prescription, an asymmetry arises that might put this interpretation in jeopardy. In the prescriptive side, the comparison of an imperfect X with a more perfect X would make the X look like less of an X to an observer. For instance, a 100-year older would look short-lived in comparison to a god. In the case of a description, however, the relation should be inverse. Once one compares an imperfect X with what it is to be an X, the comparison should provide a better appreciation of an imperfect X. For instance, knowing the form of beauty allows Socrates to see the beauty in every young man. Given this difference, we may need to distinguish truth maker and the canon for a value measure. Once again, the Timeaus offers a possible answer. Concerning the different degrees or modes of having a property, the Timeaus has a particular way to explain it based on the ability of the agent making the imitation plus some external constraints. We find the model of eternity and the forms which are not imitations nor made by anyone, the demiurge, which by being the first imitator is not the work of an imitator either. And then we have the separation, the sempiternity of time, which is the least imperfect possible imitation because it was made by the demiurge, even though it is subject to the constraints of being generated. The gods are also made by the demiurge. The constraint here is temporal. Their beginning is not attached to the beginning of time. They are everlasting nevertheless. The demiurge finally refuses to make alternate entities because he does not want to create something that perishes. Thus, he transfers this task to the gods, which have to imitate the demiurge's imitation. Whether one reads the role of the demiurge and the gods in the Timeaus literally or as a myth, it must have at least an interpretative function. Not being created by a demiurge differentiates models from imitations. After all, imitations must have a model, but not vice versa. Also, being created by different craftsmen distinguishes the mode of total duration in some imitations and others. Thus, it seems that it's not the comparison with the model, but the ability of the craftsman which is serving as a value measure in the thick conception of exemplification by imitation in Plato. Whether one reads the role of the craftsman as literal or metaphorical will change the interpretation of predication in this case. Those who do not accept the existence of a craftsman will have to ground the value measure of total duration elsewhere. We have seen that relying on the form might not work. A possibility is to rely on a comparison between the different sorts or classes of imitations. Thus, in comparison to the everlastingness of God, the alternity of humans would be pathetic, and so on. If so, the understanding of the forms increases our appreciation of the imitations, while there is also a hierarchy of value made either by comparison between different sorts of imitations or by the acts of different craftsmen and external constraints. We have acquired a well-determined understanding of how being an ordinary predication works in the Timeaus. It is a thick exemplification of a property which includes a descriptive and a prescriptive side. Moreover, something exemplifies a property by being an imitation of a model. The truth value of the descriptive side is grounded by the relation between imitation and model, while the value measure of the prescriptive side depends on the comparison between different classes of imitations or different craftsmen. With these features in mind, let us now turn to understand what happens when the model occupies the subject position in a predication. To tackle the problem of predication about forms, it will be once more useful to start with a vague notion and then build a more determinate interpretation. Contemporary Platonists use the term encoding to differentiate how an abstract object has some of its properties in opposition to concrete objects exemplifying them. There are different proposals in an attempt to determine what are the conditions for encoding a property. Our task, of course, is to conceive what encoding means for Plato based on the case study of eternity in the Timeaus. This time, however, we have already a determined notion of ordinary predication to build upon. In the dialogue, there is a strong distinction between what is a model and what has a model and is made by an imitator. Imitations must be imperfect by definition, while forms are not produced by imitators, have no models, and are perfect. Thus, perfection offers the simplest way to conceive how a predication with a form at the single term position differs from an ordinary one. If so, encoding a perfect property cannot happen by imitation. Abandoning the constraints of being an imitation leads to immediate interesting consequences. If forms do not exemplify that properties by imitation, they would not need a model. If so, we avoid the third man type of regress. For this regress depends on requiring a higher order model, serving as a model for the properties exemplified by the forms. Avoiding the third man is certainly an advantage, but the lack of a model would make the forms miss their truth makers. Moreover, if there is no craftsman, they would also lack a value measure. The lack of an imitator might not be a problem, since they are perfect and what is perfect must be equally perfect. There is no need for a value measure anyway. The cause of not having a truth maker is less clear, but not being generated according to a model might be read as Plato's personified way of saying that they are a priori metaphysical truths. Thus, as in the modern notion of analytical truths, sentences about forms would not require external truth makers. This reading fits Plato's use of self-predications as if they were self-evidently true, in spite of the fact that if read as ordinary predications, these sentences are evidently false. Given the plausibility of this simple interpretation, one might be tempted to see encoding in Plato as a case of a perfect exemplification, which, by definition, rules out the possibility of being an imitation, having a model, and being made by an imitator. However, this solution might be too simple to make sense of what happens in the Timeaus. It is time to see how the dialogue leads us to problems concerning the forms that escape the discussions which were based on the other occurrences of self-predication. Eternity in the Timeaus is discussed in opposition to time, its less imperfect imitation. The latter is famously defined as an image moving according to number in opposition to the model, which is at rest in unity. But there is a problem with the latter description. Being at rest and unique applies not only to the form of eternity, but rather to every and any form. As such, the description would not qualify as a definition of eternity. The problem is even more serious because the same may be said of all the properties attributed to the eternity at this passage. Here there is a table with at least most of the attributed properties. make the point clear, if one substitutes the form of eternity for the form of justice, all the attributes of the left column would apply. The positive conclusion is that there is a set of properties that something, by being a form or an abstract object, has. We can see that they satisfy the Parmenidean criterion for being. So let us call it the set of Parmenidean properties. We might contrast the set of properties with those of that physical objects have, because they are generated and exist in space and time. These concrete properties are those which impose the constraints on the craftsman while producing his imitations. Given the imperfection of the models, we might assume that the forms will be perfect exemplifications of all of these Parmenidean properties. However, if this is the case, and encoding is nothing but perfect exemplification, a problem of underdetermination will arise for every form which is a form of one of the properties in the Parmenidean set. To see that, let us compare the form of justice and the form of eternity, because justice is not a property of the Parmenidean set, while eternity is. The form of justice will have all the properties in the Parmenidean set, plus the distinctive property of being just. Now, in the case of eternity, the property of being eternal is already included in the set of Parmenidean properties. If so, the form of eternity will coincide with the general notion of form. The problem becomes more clear when we bring into comparison any other form of one of the properties in the Parmenidean set. Let us compare it with the form of rest. The form will also have This form will also have all and only the properties that every form has, since the property of being at rest, again, is a part or a member of the Parmenidean set. Once forms have properties as perfect exemplifications, we arrive at a situation in which the form of rest and the form of eternity will be identical. But if so, they are not unique, and uniqueness is one of the properties of the Parmenidean set. One way to avoid this problem would be looking for and adding a unique differentiating property for each form that is a form of any of the general properties of form. Thus, theirs would be like the case of the form of justice, where we have the Parmenidean property plus a distinctive property. However, even if we succeeded in finding such a property, we would still have a problem. Once again, posed by the case of the form of eternity. And here's the problem. If the form of justice is eternal, is the case of perfect exemplification of a Parmenidean property, and the form of eternity is eternal, has the same meaning by parity, we would have to accept that the form of justice is just, is also a case of perfect exemplification. Once we accept that, we fall right into the contradictory case in which the form of the movement is moving, and also the form of movement is at rest, since this is a Parmenidean property. The situation above generates a contradiction that is related but distinct of the common problem of self-predication in Plato. To state the difference clearly, the literature noticed the problem that form as an exemplification of affness will have in the cases where affness is not a property that forms as abstract objects can have, that is, those of the set of concrete properties. And for instance, the form of movement cannot move, the form of largeness cannot be large, and so on. The case of eternity in the Timeaus presents another problem, this time concerning the cases where fness is a property that all forms of abstract objects must have. After all, in these cases, the form of eternity, the form of rest, and the form of any other Parmenidean property would be identical with one another and with the general notion of form, which would be, of course, a problem. In light of these difficulties posed by the form of eternity and its treatment of the Timeaus, there are at least three desiderata that we must satisfy while thinking about how forms must have their properties. The first one, forms must have some properties which are perfect exemplifications, namely those of the Parmenidean set. Second desiderata, forms cannot have all their properties as being perfect exemplifications, because concerning some of the forms of concrete properties, this would lead to the problem of self-predication. This is the case of the form of the movement being moved. Concerning any form of the Parmenidean properties, and this is another problem, this would lead to a problem of indistinguishability. So this is the problem of the form of rest and form of eternity having the same properties. The simpler way to solve self-predication is to deny that forms have any property as perfect exemplification. All forms would encode all of its properties, and encoding is not a perfect exemplification. However, this would not satisfy the first desiderata we saw above. Another more complex solution is to accept that forms have two modes of having a property. They exemplify some and encode other of their properties. Thus, the question would be which properties would be exemplified or encoded, and based on what such a distinction could be made. The more immediate hypothesis that comes to mind is that forms exemplify their Parmenidean properties since they are shared by all. On the other hand, they would encode their concrete properties, thus avoiding the problem of self-predication. For instance, the form of movement would encode movement and exemplify rest, which would avoid the contradiction. Of course, we would still have to understand what encode means. Furthermore, since there is a group of forms which have no concrete properties, the solution would seem to be arbitrary. Once again, I believe that the cosmogonical context of the Timeaus might provide us with a more satisfactory answer. Platonic models, or the forms, as the set of Parmenidean properties of the general notion of forms shows, are abstract. Accordingly, they could never have perfect exemplifications of properties of concrete objects which demand features such as generation, a body, and extension in time. The problematic case of the form of movement expresses this interdiction. Therefore, forms cannot exemplify all of their properties. However, in the context of imitation, this problem does not seem to be so serious. As we saw right in the beginning, one of the contingent features of the relation of imitation is that model and imitation do not need to exist in the same way. Cosmologically, what a Platonic model has to do is to serve as a basis for the production of its imitations. For this whole role also, imitation and model do not need to share the same mode of existence. As an illustration, one might think about the relation between an architectural project and a building, or, in a more Platonic example, the bed in the head of the craftsman and the crafted bed. It is admittedly harder to imagine what is an abstract model of movement. However, it is clear that the function is the same. The form of movement serves as a model to be imitated in several degrees by the moving things. Once we focus On this applied way, a plausible candidate to differentiate the different ways in which forms have their predicates emerge. Compare the form of justice is eternal and the form of justice is just. The form of justice perfectly exemplifies being eternal, and yet it does not serve as a model for total durations. All forms are eternal, but the demiurge cannot look into any form to make several copies of eternity. To do so, he needs the form of eternity. Thus, to be a perfect exemplification and to be a model seem to require different types of having a property. This difference can be put in terms of the form of justice, exemplifying being eternal, and encoding, without exemplifying, being just, where encoding refers to the functional property of the form. With this distinction, we can also solve the problem of indistinguishability between forms and the Parmenidean properties. Compare the form of rest is at rest and the form of eternity is at and the form of rest is eternal. These are different predications because the former is the predication of a functional property, while the latter, the form of rest is eternal, is a perfect exemplification. The truth maker of a predication which has a form as a subject and an adjective of the same form as a predicate would be its cosmogonical role. In this framework, both the form of eternity is eternal and the form of eternity is at rest are true. However, only the former has its cosmogonical function as a truth maker. In the second one, as we saw in the case of perfect exemplifications, it is just an a priori truth about abstract objects. More importantly, the difference between the forms of eternity and the form of rest, or the identity of each one, is given by their having different functional properties. If so, the general notion of a form should be an abstract object that perfectly exemplifies all the Parmenidean properties and encodes at least one functional property that can be a Parmenidean or a concrete property. Once encoding F is not a perfect exemplification or an exemplification by imitation, there will be no problem of self-predication in the cases of concrete properties. Uh, the form of movement is moving, means that it serves as a model for moving things, and in the context of imitation, it can serve this function without having to move. So, to conclude, let me summarize the complex distinction of predications in Plato that, according to the previous argumentation, follows from the unique context of the Timeaus. X is F, the ordinary predication, means that X is a particular which exemplifies the property F by imperfect imitation of the encoded F in a form. The relation of resemblance with form serves as a truth maker, while the value measure comes from the comparison with other types of imitations of F or based on different craftsmen. B. The form of F is G, where G is a Parmenidean property, means that a form perfectly exemplifies the property without being an imitation nor having a model. Since they have no model and are perfect, there is no need for truth maker or value measure. Every form has all the properties of the Parmenidean set in the same perfect way just by being an abstract object. And C, the form of F is F, the self-predication, means that a form encodes the functional property F, where the function is defined by serving as a model for the case of ordinary predications seen above. The functional property also works as the identity-giving property of a form, which differentiates it from the other forms. It is also useful to be aware of how the context of imitation is operative. Exemplification by imitation requires that the copies have resemblance and imperfection in different degrees. The form, serving as a model, will serve as the remote cause of the production. The acts of the craftsman and the material constraints explain the different qualities of exemplifications by imitation. The impossibility of such a thing as perfect copies rules out the need for a model in the case of a property of abstract objects shared by all the forms. Finally, the possibility of model and imitation existing in a very different way, such as abstrata and concreta, allow forms to encode properties that they do not exemplify and still accomplish their function of serving as models. So I hope that you share my feeling that interpretation makes some sense. If this model is applicable to the other much discussed passages of self-predication in Plato, this is something that still needs to be done. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope it was clear.
Thank you very much. I kindly ask people to raise their hands in order to ask questions. So first, Victor. The audio, Victor, the microphone.
I think it was Daniel who raised his hand first. I mean...
No, I've seen you making this.
oh, did I? So,
yes, you did. So
it was a pantomime, but no.
That is Daniel.
Yes.
So shall I ask? Okay. So thank you, Celso. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I really like it, and it was really illuminating in many things, in many aspects. I guess I have two sets of questions or general worries, but and I guess I'll first ask. I will first want to ask you. So what is? Perhaps I missed this because I was having trouble connecting, but I was wondering whether you can give us a little bit more context of where this paper is fitting in this. Is this for a journal? Is this for a bigger project? Is this what is exactly the audience for this?
I don't know. Probably this presentation is exactly the audience. I mean, I had this. I did some research at the Vlastos archive, and he deals a lot with self-predication. And I always thought that the case of the Timeaus is underrepresented, and I always wanted to explore it. So yeah, when and I had many notes about it, and when this opportunity came up, I just thought it would be a nice first step for me to put it in order. So this is the context that's not really
okay. So I'm asking that as a context for the next question, which is, so I'm worried that or with some of the things you do in terms of the methodology to approach Plato. So you kind of use this list of distinctions of total duration, and you give all these contemporary distinctions, and you use them to kind of go back and read Plato. But I guess someone more interested in reading Plato kind of very slowly and just kind of interested in understanding the text as it is might object to that methodology and say that you are kind of pushing these distinctions into the text where there is none, or not all of them in that sense. I guess that's one worry I have, and it's with this list of total duration, but also with some of the things you say about predication.
Yeah.
So I guess I wonder how would you deal with that kind of worry, or if you think there is a way to escape that kind of line of objections.
Yeah, that's a perfect plausible objection, and yeah, I do kind of I don't know, apply some sort of a reductionist approach to the text. But yeah, I would justify saying that yeah, so I'm trying to understand how the predication works, and once we have a clear understanding of how predication works, we will be better instrumentally more apt to read the text. So that would be my answer. So it is a different methodology. I'm not trying to make, as you notice, a very deep examination of the Plato's text, but I guess the methodology that I'm using will give us a, I don't know, a better understanding of how predication works. And with that understanding, we might then go to the text and try to do a more traditional history of philosophy approach that would, of course, require more careful readings. So yeah, I don't know, I would more
Can I just have a
question. Yeah, of course.
So I guess, so I agree with your general project, and in fact, I like the solution you give for predication. I will have to kind of think more with more time about it and whatever. But I think that I'm really sympathetic with your general approach to the self-predication problem. But for example, for me, it was a little off-putting the bit about total duration and all that, because you might think that, for example, the list of distinctions you give is very useful, but it's very useful to recognize that Plato is not making some of those distinctions, and that might be a problem for Plato. So, for example, when you talk about eternity, I don't think that Plato distinguishes that from eternity.
I see.
And that's probably a limitation or something that he didn't thought through or something.
Yeah.
But I guess that bit might get in the way to persuade people of your more general main claim, and that's I guess the worry I had. But I'll leave others to talk, and then I'll come back with some other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. It helps a lot. I'll try to pay more attention to it. Just a quick follow-up. The specific point of eternity is made by Robson in. So it is a paper about Plato, and he's trying to understand his uses of the adjectives that Plato used to explain the eternity or explain being eternal, and he coins the term ab eternal to justify the creation of Plato of the term diaionios. So yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I'll have a look at that, but I'm still kind of skeptical about that.
Victor, yes.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thanks to the speaker for this interesting talk. I would actually love to have the opportunity to read the entire text and check the bibliography, as it is the case with the two previous talks we heard. But for now, I will try to pose a question that might be of interest, and also I have a few very tiny objections which are not that important. For example, let me start with just one of those. As far as I remember, you said that the demiurge entrusted the job of creating the individual bodies on account of his dislike to create perishable things. Well, I believe that Plato's idea in the Timaeus is that the demiurge is actually not capable of creating perishable things, in a sense, which would mean that if he would create, the turnout would be sempiternal. So, in a sense, he's impotent of creating imperfect things. But that's, I don't know whether you agree, but I don't think that's a very important matter. So this would be one. But the other thing that might be important is that I cannot recall that anywhere in the relevant passages Plato states plainly and clearly that eternity is eternal. Also, I'm not absolutely certain that eternity must necessarily be a form. I don't think it is stated clearly either. You used one expression yourself, which is mode of existence, and it is for the time being, it is my firm belief that eternity in the Timaeus is actually more of a mode of existence of the eternal world than a separate form, or as Timaeus himself states, eternity is the nature of the living thing, of the model. So in a sense, if this is a plausible approach, it would be something like Kant's formal features for perception and intellection, that is the space and time. In a similar way, time is not on a par with the other created object in the universe. Is a more of a condition of its life. In a same way, eternity on this view would be a condition or a formal feature or mode of existence of the eternal world or the world of form. So yes, I don't want to take more of everybody's time, so that would be it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for your suggestions. I will look again at the passage of concerning the demiurge being or not capable of creating. But yeah, for my reading, I guess, as you well noticed, it is more important. It is only important that it is a differentiating factor between what perishes and what does not perish. So yeah, but I will look at that again. And yeah, I mean, it's not clear. It is clear that eternity serves as a model, and it's clear that eternity is eternal. And yeah, I take this evidence to and forms, they are eternal, and forms also serve as a model. So I take this as an evidence, but I completely accept that it's not it's not out of discussion that it may be just another mode of existence, that it's not a form and it's not a sensible thing, and it is something in between. But I would still think that it is an interesting case if for us to understand what Plato is talking when he's using this sort of self-predication, or how come he understands these relations when the subject and the predicate are so close to each other, and yet it's not a statement of identity. So yeah, I guess that would be my answer. But yeah, I agree with you. It's more willingness to play the game or not.
Thank you.
Are there other questions, remarks, doubts? Also because, I mean, the talk was, Daniel, you? Okay. Yeah, please.
Okay. So I guess I have another question, and this is about the last part of your paper. Perhaps correct me if I got it wrong, because it was really, but I was kind of what is the predication functional properties, which is a kind of solution to offer. And you said something like, oh, what it means is that it serves as a model for that property, or and so on. Now, then you said that when they, let me see. So there are, when a form is, you say the justice is eternal and justice is just, and one is the justice is the form of justice is a perfect example, eternity. But when we predicate the form of justice is just, that is a predication of a functional property. Now, you said, I think, that means that it's not a predication of a functional property is not an imitation, nor has a model. And that applies for Parmenidean properties. But then I guess my question is, so what is the relation in justice that are of eternity, if one cannot be that one is for the other? I don't know if I kind of.
I'm sorry. The audio failed in the last bit of your question. So
okay. So I guess my question succinctly is, if I understood you correctly, when we say that the form of justice is eternal, that is a perfect example, right?
Right.
So eternity or the form of justice is eternal in the sense that it's a perfect example of eternity. Now, does that mean that it's not an imitation and not a model, or something like that?
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, if the form of justice is eternal, but that doesn't mean that it's that it's eternity. It's an imitation, or it's following a model. Then what is the form of justice relation with the form of eternity? If there or there is no relation, or what is the
Yeah, I guess they are only in my reading, of course, the only relation that they share are the fact that they are some sort of abstract objects, and by being so, they have to follow some constraints of being an abstract object, which imply being unique, having no body, being homogeneous, being eternal, being at rest, and yeah, these are what they have in common. And what distinguishes them, the problem is that all the forms would have these properties in the same way, so we would need something to distinguish them, and to distinguish them we have to take their functional role and understand that the eternity that the form of eternity has is a functional property, while the eternity that the form of justice has is not a functional property. So that a demiurge who wants to create something with a total duration cannot look at the form of justice, but it can look at the form of eternity. It makes sense?
Yeah, that's clear. Thank you. That's, I guess, so I guess I was kind of following and understanding you on that. But I guess then I worry that there is no need for the form of eternity.
Yeah, there is, because we have several of types of total durations in the world, and these total durations need to be an imitation of a perfect eternity. And since the other forms, they are eternal, but they don't have eternity as a functional property, for the demiurge to create the different total durations, he has to have the form of eternity.
But why would so if we have forms that are eternal in the sense that are perfect examples, why would that so what would restrict the demiurge from taking that as the model?
Yeah, that's, I don't know what would restrict, but the problem is if we accept this reading that the form of eternity has the same, having eternity for the form of justice is the same way that the form of eternity has the form of eternity. By parity, we would have to accept that the form of movement has movement in the same way, by being a moving thing. And this would lead us to the problem of self-predication. So it's more like
yeah, so I guess I see that. Now, I guess my last question, if I'm allowed, is just to ask you about, so I think what your interpretation might have some interesting implications for arguments about where to put the Timeaus in the order of composition. I am not sure, but one of the worries, or one of my questions was about whether, so, or perhaps Victor knows better than me, but I'm not sure that forms in the Timeaus are said to be at rest. I think they are only always this. So there are some other formulations and so on, but the thing is that in the sophist, for example, the kinds are not at rest. They are perhaps always the same, or they are fully and things like that. But at the end, it seems that in some sense, things that move are included in the same set, like mind, or like, well, nous. So I guess looking at those details might imply certain things about whether the Timeaus is before or after the Parmenides and the Sophist or something like that. Do you have any views on that?
No, I do not have, but I do think that I mean, while defining defining time as a moving sequence according to number, he contrasts it with the model, which I'm taking to be the model in the form of eternity, and he defines it as monotones. So abiding in unity, and this monotones, it has the implied notion that it is at rest, but yeah, outside of that, I cannot. I guess this is my piece of evidence, and I don't know
Okay.
how we can. I mean, it is interesting to think how this reading could make us think about the order of the dialogues. I'm really interested also in thinking how this reading would compare with the notion of participation, if it is, because I guess it is really different if we think about imitation and we think about participation. So I'm really interested in these bigger context issues as well, but yeah, I didn't have the time to figure them out.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for your questions. They were really useful.
Okay, is there other are there other issues that you want to raise? Yes, Victor. The microphone, Victor.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, so I was thinking, I mean, it is a rather rich paper, so it's kind of difficult to get all the points in one hearing. But I was thinking, like, by the end of the text and your ways to your suggestions how to kind of distinguish the forms from one another, if they all possess the Parmenidean properties, as you call it, isn't it? So I was just thinking, being a simple-minded person, isn't it rather obvious that eternity, if it is a form, has a relational property with time that is that clearly distinguishes it from all other forms, because none of the other serves as a model for time that we have in this world. I don't know whether I made myself clear.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, maybe it's a simple point that I put it in a more rather complicated way, but I do think that it is interesting to notice that if we do not take this functional, this cosmogonical role into consideration, we would fall into a problem of indistinguishability of certain forms, of those forms who are forms of a property that all the forms have. So yeah, maybe it is a complicated way to put a simple point, but I guess it is an interesting, even if a very detailed thing to think.
Yes. Oh, so okay, so that's exactly what I mean. That's close to what you were saying. Or say, okay, you just say it in a very sophisticated way and made some other connections and further implications for the theory of forms. And okay, thank you. This was a clarificatory question, actually. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thomas. The microphone, Thomas, we cannot hear you. Maybe you can write your question in the chat if it's not very long, because I think that there is something wrong with the audio setup. So you have to go to the audio settings of Teams and change them probably. Or just if you don't use the headphones, maybe that it works. I don't know. So I guess you're writing the question. Okay, so it will appear in the chat. Just okay, so
Oh, now I have.
here there is the question. If I get you right, you would say that Plato modifies his theory of form by functional qualification, the Timeaus, right? What do you mean by that exactly? Some kind of telic or teleological explanation?
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that Plato exposes the functional properties of forms as their main cosmogonical role. I don't know, I guess I wouldn't put it as a telic explanation. I would put more as some sort of a causal explanation without contact, so that the forms can have a cosmogonical role without having contact, without ceasing to be separated from the material beings, and there is therefore the need of an intermediator, which it is the craftsman who puts this model into the things in the world. So it would be more a remote causal role than a telic one, I guess. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Now I have a question then, in the sense that you said they have a more causal role. So they don't have a telic role in your view, right? Am I?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that they don't have, but it's not the central point that I am taking as, I don't know, as a motivation of my investigation, but yeah.
So, but you say that they don't have a telic role because we can clearly identify a causal role, even if a remote causal one, but still a causal one.
Yeah.
Okay. Thomas, do you want to have a follow-up? Thomas? I cannot see you anymore. Thomas? I don't know whether Thomas is still online.
Yeah, maybe he's having problems with the internet.
Thomas, if you're still online, can you write in the chat just yes or no? No, so he's not. Okay, so meanwhile, I'm asking you guys if they have other issues that you want to raise. If not, we can. Okay, so Thomas is back. Yes, so no, don't worry. So do you want to have a follow-up of the question, Thomas? Because I've seen that you raised your hand. I didn't know whether it was, the previous hand raised that was still there, or if you had follow-up. Yes or no?
Can you hear me right now?
Yes, now we
Yeah.
can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Because for the question, I ask this exactly because I thought something similar as Daniel when you put it like this, that you would claim maybe that Plato wants to establish a modified theory of forms in Timaeus, and then maybe you have good reason to be critical with Owen's claim of the place in the Timaeus in the corpus, and I would be interested if you have thought about that, and also maybe on the impact of Aristotelian explanations concerning the natural world and so on and so on. But this is a big issue, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say about the role of my interpretation in if it would change the way we see the order of the dialogues, but yeah, the problem is that I mean Plato, he uses self-predication in all types of dialogue, but I guess they are not the same. They do not mean the same in each part. So in the case of the first uses of the earlier dialogues, he's clearly using it in connection to some sort of a look for a definition. So the justice is justice, a clear case in which you can substitute the form of justice for the right definition of justice. And then in the middle dialogues, he doesn't care that much or exclusively with the definition. And I guess that the Timeaus doesn't have that concern with definitions that we identified in the earlier one. So this is the easier thing for us to do the distinction, but the hard distinction would be between middle and late dialogues. And yeah, I have to think more about it to give a proper question, a proper answer. But I do think that, I mean, he doesn't seem to bother too much with the problems of theory of forms of the middle period. So it might indicate that it is more to a later period. But yeah, I'm just thinking it right now, so I wouldn't trust myself concerning these questions. But yeah, this is what I can think about it. So I mean, the problems of a third man and etc. They do not seem to play any sort of, not even as an afterthought in the cosmogony of the Timeaus. So I know we probably had already dismissed this sort of thing. So yeah.
So, well, if there are no other questions or follow-ups, I would like to thank again our speaker.
Thank you very much.
We will continue with other meetings of the Ancient Philosophy Seminar and activities. Of course, you are more than welcome to join those activities. And good luck to you, Celso, for your new job.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And eat many bratwurst, they're really good there. So enjoy Germany for once, really. It's not bad. Okay. So thank you, and see you at least with this group in 2021.
Okay.
Have a nice Christmas break and happy new 2021.
Okay, thank you everybody for having the patience and posing so much interesting questions. So if you have any further questions or critiques, you just send me an email and I'll be glad to think about it, because it is something that I'm starting to work with. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Celso.
Thank you,
Daniel. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.